Good afternoon, Mr. Chan. It's a wonderful place you've got here in the East Midlands. It's great to have you on our podcast, and thank you for taking out the time. So it's Chan Kataria.
Yep.
You're the CEO of the East Midlands Housing Group. And before that, you were the Regional Director of the Midlands and East Anglia Places for People.
Yes.
We'll chat about that in a second. Now, I think people listening to this will think, why do we even want to hear about what housing association is? What's housing got to do with anything? But if I said, when you joined the organisations 20 odd years ago, you had a turnover of 19 million, 8,000 homes, so that's the sort of products you look after, 245 staff. Today, you have a revenue of 130 million. Remember, started with 19 million. You have now 20,000 homes in management, and you have 1,100 staff. So anybody listening to this will say, gosh, that's some rapid growth. So actually today I'm interested in not just understanding what housing is and what your leadership style is, but how did you manage to grow an organisation from that to that? So that's what I'm really intrigued in, but we'll get into that in a second. But let's just give it some context then. Housing association. What is a housing association, and why should anybody even be interested in what a housing association is?
Well, that's a really good question, Ninder. And firstly, may I just say what a privilege it is to be part of your famous podcast. I know
thank you. Great to have you here. Yep, thank you.
Interviewed many famous people.
Thank you.
Of which I'm not one. But starting with your question, which is about what are housing associations, it's a question that a lot of people ask. And basically, housing associations go back to the Victorian philanthropic era. So many of the names you would know today, Guinness, Peabody, Cadbury, were all Victorian philanthropists who created something akin to a housing association because they provided affordable housing. Clearly, they had other motivations because a well-housed workforce was more likely to be productive. Nowadays, of course, housing associations are big, diverse businesses, and essentially we're a not-for-profit organisation and sector. Now, when I say not-for-profit, we clearly have to make profit, because if we didn't, the banks would not be happy, and the capital market would not be happy, because we, in our case, borrow £500 million from them.
Wow.
So there are all sorts of covenants that we have to comply with. So we do have to make profit. But the essential thing is that profit is not our overriding motivation. And when we do make profits, those are not distributed to shareholders. They are ploughed back into the business. So really, that's the general overview of what housing associations are. But essentially, we provide affordable housing, which is sub-market housing, for those people who can't afford to find their own solutions in the free market.
Right, so let me get this right. So a housing association fills a gap for people who can't secure housing from private landlords or can't buy their own house.
Yeah.
So they come to you and say, we need somewhere to stay.
Yeah, that's essentially it. Basically, people, if they can afford to do so, would buy their own house. Many people, if they can afford to do so, would rent from the private rented sector. But there are other people who are particularly the disadvantaged people in society, for whom those are not real options. So affordable housing or sub-market housing is something we provide mostly for people in need who cannot access housing solutions elsewhere within the housing market.
So here's my next question then. So most businesses operate in a competitive environment. Now you've grown big time. So there's two ways of looking at this. Either you're better than the competition, either you're brilliant at what you do, or actually there's so much demand that it's no surprise that you've grown. Is it amalgamating all of them or one of them, or?
Yes, I would say it's an amalgamation of all of those issues. I mean, the basic overriding factor here is that when I started in this organisation in 2004, we had 8,000 homes. But actually, we know at that time, there were a number of local authorities who were looking to transfer the housing stock into housing associations. And the reason they do that is they're part of the public sector. They simply didn't have the money to invest in their existing homes, to modernise them, to make them energy efficient and so on. So really, we had a couple of local authorities who transferred their stock into EMH. The other avenue for growth was through organisations that are struggling because of governance and regulation problems. And like any businesses, there are some organisations that are well run, there are others that are less so. And in the case of a couple of these organisations, they were struggling. They had leadership issues, governance problems, and we went through a competitive process to invite them into the group. Made a bid for them effectively.
Yeah.
And basically our role was to turn them round, to ensure that they had a governance and financial regime that was fit for purpose. So that's where a lot of the growth has happened, through acquisition.
Acquisition, okay.
But of course, as well as that, we've had organic growth. We do develop up to 500 new homes a year. Because, as you rightly pointed out, Ninder, there's huge demand for affordable housing. There are 1.2 million people on housing waiting lists nationally.
So let's look at that definition. What does that mean, affordable housing? What does that mean to somebody on the street? What does affordable housing mean?
Yeah, so essentially, affordable housing is sub-market housing, so that's the first thing to say. The traditional product, if you like, that we have are social housing tenancies. These are highly regulated tenancies where the government has strict rules to determine what the rent level should be. These are called convergence rents. And not only rules about what they should be, but how much they should be increased by, or the maximum amount they could be increased by each year. So highly regulated rents, that's one definition of affordable rents. The other is there's, after the George Osborne and Cameron government came in 2015, they created something called affordable housing, which is basically 80% of market rents, which is another type of affordable housing, but it's actually called affordable housing and defined as 80% of market rents, up to 80%. So the common element here is the fact that all of these rents are below market rents.
So the next question, as somebody who's a business leader, if someone's telling you you can't charge more than X, that puts a lot of pressure on you making sure your costs are tight because you've got to keep that margin in order to keep reinvesting. Have I got that right? Does that make that difficult?
Absolutely right, yes. So if our rents are capped, which they have to be because they're affordable rents, and your costs are going up, phenomenally over the last few years. We've had a combination of different factors which on their own would have been challenging in themselves, but put together, Brexit, the Ukrainian war, now the latest situation in Gaza. You combine all of those factors, and what we have is a combination of high inflation and supply chain constraints. Both of those things mean that we can't get the staff we need for some aspects of the business. Our costs of production are going up, particularly development and maintenance. Costs of material going up. And basically, we've had to continue to develop new homes and provide excellent services at a time when costs are going up, but our rents have not gone up by the same extent.
So how did you?
So, and it doesn't get easier, of course. And the fact of the matter is that, like any business, we've been squeezed over the last, I would say, 10 years, last decade. Because remember, it all started from the financial crisis.
Yeah. 2008,
in
yeah.
2008-9. It just means you've got to be very careful that you manage your capacity really well. So, you know, in the past you would have been able to do 600 new homes a year. You look at 450 to 500 new homes a year. It means that value for money and efficiency are absolutely crucial. It means that you make sure that all the money you spend, you get the best possible value through sound procurement practices, through good treasury management, and, you know, ensuring that wherever possible, your costs go up by less than your income. Now that's difficult for the reasons we mentioned, but it's something we have to do because there is an existential issue here. We're finding that a lot of our SME building contractors are going bust.
Yeah.
That's another reason why costs are going up, and it's becoming more difficult to continue to produce the number of homes we used to do.
So let me sum this up. You're operating in a marketplace where the government stipulates what you charge. The government can't protect you from the challenges on the outside. The government introduces living wage and those things and says you have to pay that, but you can't charge more. Your role is, unlike a private sector landlord, if there's a waiting list, you have to do something with that waiting list. They can walk away if they wanted to. And affordable housing means you now have a social contract with your marketplace because you're there to help them, to protect them. And all of that you've got to do whilst at the same time staying solvent.
Yeah, indeed. And as we said earlier, we have to make a profit because we have very strong, tight covenants with the banks and the capital markets. So we have to make a certain margin. We have to continue to provide new homes because of immense housing needs. But above all, we have to continue to provide the best possible services, because the other thing you'll know, Ninder, is the fact that the regulatory standards have really, really gone up. And this is all to do with the fact that post-Grenfell tragedy, which, you know, happened in 2017 when 72 people sadly lost their life, something that should never have happened. And then more recently, there have been cases of service failures within the sector, damp and mould, property conditions not being as high as they should have been. All of those things have combined and culminated in the Social Housing Regulation Act, which has many provisions within it. But one of the things that we can all be absolutely certain about is it means a lot higher standards that we've got to provide and meet. And actually, philosophically, it's very difficult to disagree with that because our consumers deserve the best.
Just looking at what you said earlier, you said by the way, are you targeted to build a number of houses?
Yes.
Is it a target given to you? And who gives you that target?
So we don't get given a target. What we do is to agree a target with Homes England. So we're a strategic partner with Homes England, which is a government body responsible for ensuring the government's housing and regeneration objectives are met. So Homes England, one of the ways in which they do that is to contract strategic partners like EMH for us to agree with them to build an X number of homes for which they provide us some part funding for that. So that's the nature of the contract.
But if that's fixed and all these costs are going up, you're stuffed.
Yes, indeed, of course we've got to. If we've made a commitment to deliver X number of homes for Y grant,
that's right,
and suddenly we find the costs are going up, but the Y grant is still the same Y grant, not Y plus 1, then it does mean that we've got to flex our capacity to continue to develop in the way that we have done. Now, Homes England have, as an extraordinary support that the government provided last year, recognise that inflation has caused this issue for organisation. So they did give us additional grant, but this is a one-off exceptional grant, and it's worth pointing out that really the grant doesn't cover anywhere near the proportion of the total cost of building a home as it used to in the old days.
So the government must be cognizant, and maybe that's why they dropped the entire targets around housing. Maybe they've now realised it's just impossible. With all these extraneous factors, it's just impossible to set targets. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I mean, the government has a target, of course, to deliver 300,000 homes a year. I don't remember any year where that target was actually met. I think last year was something in the region of 220,000 homes that we built as a country. Now, if they want to build anything like 300,000 homes a year, then housing associations have to be part of that solution. Because housing associations build around 40 to 50,000 homes a year. So it's a significant portion. The rest are built by the private sector for owner occupation and other tenures. But really, you need housing associations, and the government recognises that, and they're doing all they can within the constraints of public sector borrowing constraints.
So let's look at the complexity of what you've got. You've got 20,000 homes. You've got to ensure those homes, particularly after Grenfell, are maintained properly. You've got to make sure if a boiler breaks down and they pick up the phone, there's somebody at the end of a phone to pick up. You've got to make sure that whoever picks that phone up is empathetic, sympathetic, and then has a system to tell them this is when the repair person's coming out. You then have to make sure that repair person goes out when he or she said they would go out. Then you need to make sure that the repair has been done to the level it was supposed to be done. Otherwise, people are going to come slapping on your hand. But you've got 1,100 staff. Somehow you've got to make all of those things happen on time, in the right place, at the right time, and make sure it's done. And here's your own quoted at the right cost, because remember, it's been time. How do you do that? How do you, sitting where you are, Chan, make sure all of those things happen? Because unlike a private landlord who might get sued in court ultimately, you've got a huge stakeholder base knocking on your door and saying, listen, we're hearing things and we're not going to give you any more money. So as a leader, how do you do that?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's a challenge, of course. But it's a leadership challenge, and,
that's right.
And it's an important challenge that the board and I and the executive team have to meet. So, I mean, for a start, you need to make sure that, for me, culture is everything. Make sure you recruit the right people with the right values and the right approach. You referred earlier to empathetic services. Yeah, we employ some really good people who are deeply committed, strongly values-based, who want to make a difference to the lives of our consumers. So having the right people is absolutely crucial. And it's not just about employing the right people and recruiting them. Clearly that's an essential element of this, but making sure you onboard them, making sure you train and recruit them. So I'll give you an example. All of our leaders are trained, 100% of them are trained as coaches.
Oh.
So in other words, they coach their colleagues to ensure we get the best performance possible. Coaching is so important because the opposite of that is top-down management, which we know doesn't work. If you want to get the best out of people, ensuring that they find the solutions, because they're the people who know the best way to do things at the ground level, then coaching is an important element of that. So that's one thing. But as you made reference to earlier, it's about having systems and processes in place. Now, that means that when we do occasionally get things wrong, I'm all for saying we got it wrong. There's a complaints process in place. This is what we'll do to learn from it. And we apologise because we got it wrong. And I think all too often we know that when we have, as you say, over 20,000 properties and over 50,000 people living in our homes, I'll be the last person to say that we get it right 100% of the time. But the trick is to know when we do get it wrong and to own it and say we got it wrong. And this is what we'll do to get it right. And this is what we've learned from it to make sure that the likelihood of that happening again is not right. I mean, the other thing really is that, we're all, like every other business in this environment, we're going through a transformation process. We're looking at the skills and capabilities of our staff. We're looking at technology, possibility of digital solutions. We're looking, at all of those things, culture again, to make sure that we remain fit for purpose. So one of the most important things I think we're doing at the moment, is to look to do an end-to-end review of the whole repairs process. Right from when a consumer reports repair to when it's completed, and then the aftercare. There are so many steps involved in that process, different teams, different people, to make sure we streamline that as much as possible. So I suppose in short the answer to your question is having the right processes, systems, people and culture. And actually above all, it's making sure that the leadership provided by the executive team and the board is the right is of the right quality, the right leadership, because in the end leadership is about making sure you get the best out of the people. And you don't do it by having, for instance, a blame culture. You don't do it by, for instance, when things go wrong, you look for a scapegoat. This is all about an organisation where values are the bedrock of what we're all about, and people share those values, including the leaders. Then I think we're more likely to have better staff retention and able to recruit more people than we would do otherwise.
So a couple of questions. How do people react when you say to them, we want you to be coaches? Because that's not what they probably thought when they walked through for the interview. And then, by the way, you're now going to coach. I mean, how do people react? Because that's quite different, isn't it, to saying to people, you're managing these people, now in fact, no, you're coaching them, and actually we want you to be coaches. How do they react?
Yeah, so I think culture is about the way we do things, in short. And you can have an enabling culture, or you can have a culture that's opposite to that. Now, I know, and you know, that you're more likely to get buy-in from staff, engender staff loyalty, and get the best out of people if there is cognizance and convergence between the values that they have and the values of the organisation. So one of the things we do is we've adopted this Barrett Values Assessment methodology, where every so often we ask staff about what are the values that are most important to them. What are the values they'd like to see within the organisation being displayed? And thirdly, what are the values do they actually see being displayed across the organisation in different teams and so on? And the greater the greater the divergence between what they want to see in terms of values and behaviours and what they actually witness, the less likely we are to have staff engaged, and the less likely we are to have motivated people. So it's a methodology we use to make sure that we close the gap between what's important to people and what the organisation actually displays in terms of values and behaviours. Because it is all about people. As you said earlier, 1,100 colleagues. If you get the right people, the right board members, the right staff, they produce the right outcomes, and I look good.
So you used the word transformation earlier, and you said transformation across staff, across tech, digital systems. When does a leader think it needs to be transformational versus an incremental approach? So an incremental approach is bit by bit. Transformation is actually, let's look at the whole thing, turn it upside down, and actually this could be rapid change. What are the circumstances that determine which of the two? Because you definitely used the word so what, I suppose, if it is, what pushed you to take the transformation rather than the incremental approach? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. That's a really good question. I mean, I think I would say to that that when the environment is changing rapidly,
Okay.
and actually if you look at the socio-economic environment, the current political situation where there's a lot of uncertainty about when the election will be,
Yeah.
for instance, in terms of the economics we've talked about, technically we're in a recession. There's a huge cost of living crisis. And our consumers are at the tail end of that, not to mention some frontline staff. So if and the new legislation in terms of Social Housing Regulation Act and so on. So when the environment is changing more rapidly, then I think there is an argument to say that we as a business should be looking at transformation. Of course, generally speaking, we do make incremental changes as part of day-to-day management anyway, because, that's something that happens on a daily basis. We're dealing with customers, their circumstances change, we deal with contractors who are going through, some of whom are going through a difficult period. We work with lenders and capital markets when we borrow bond finance, and their criteria change. So we always make incremental changes because no organisation stays the same. But transformational change, I think, will increasingly determine which organisations succeed and prosper and which ones won't. And I suppose it's about saying the environment is going at this rate. We cannot afford to change at this rate. Transformation is about bridging that gap.
Mm. And so, probably this is going to be a difficult question, I think, to answer. Maybe because I don't know the answer myself. But in order to determine which of the two, are there certain KPIs? I know you talked about the intangibles, the chaotic environment that sort of might prompt you. But is there any particular KPIs you think, hold on, boom, that number doesn't look right, that doesn't look right, this needs transformation, as opposed to, is there any particular?
Yes, I'll give you a good example there. We have as part of our group housing and care business, we have a care subsidiary, which employs around 500 staff.
It's not small.
But actually, in terms of turnover, it's about 18 million. So financially, as part of the group as a whole, it's a small turnover. But it's a significant business because it provides some life-changing services, transformative services for people who are suffering from learning difficulties, or if you're frail and aged and require care services. So some of those services are absolutely essential for people to lead an inclusive life. Now, the care business is going through a particular crisis. The care sector is going through a huge crisis. And there, I suppose the view is, an organisation that's suffering from a reducing income in relation to the cost, but the costs are really going up. We need a transformative approach. So it's clear to me that if you look at the financial position, the bottom line there, and the fact that the commissioning bodies, who are mostly local authorities, their income, their commissioning fees have not kept pace with the costs providing those services. And that has become particularly acute over the last 3-4 years post-pandemic. And actually now it's going to get a lot worse because a lot of local authorities are issuing Section 114 notices. They're effectively going bust. And when you're knocking on the door to say, you're contracting us to provide the services, but you're not paying us to cover the costs of those services, it becomes a difficult conversation when they've got an existential crisis. So to me, that requires a more transformative approach than an incremental one.
Or the simple solution is divest it, sell it. But is that conflicting with the values of what you're trying to do for your community? Is that the problem? You can't really make that kind of...
Absolutely right, Ninder. Yes, of course, if you were a private sector organisation motivated by the bottom line and nothing else, then there's no doubt that divestment would be the most obvious. We're not making money here, so we'll remove that service. To me, we have a greater consideration than that. And the fact of the matter is, the care business has always made a profit. but simply because over the last 2 years, it's not made a profit. Does not mean we suddenly abandon it. We do have reserves, and we do continue to, have discussions with the local authority to say that, we need to work in collaboration to resolve this issue, which they have a statutory obligation towards, let's face it. So, no, divestment is always an option, but a very last option.
So, how difficult a conversation is that then around a board of governors, around non-exec directors sitting with you as you meet regularly? They're part of your stakeholder engagement. So you give them a set of figures which point towards, in a private sector world, divestment, but you've got this other problem, this the responsibility, which is to look after the community. And then you've got a set of board directors, some of them might be accountants, and saying, well, actually, so as part of your role as a leader is managing stakeholders, including non-exec directors. Does that make your job a lot more difficult? You've mentioned councils, you mentioned government policy, you've got staff, you've got your customers or clients, you've got your bankers, you've talked about them, you've talked about covenants and raising more money and keeping the money, you've got your senior leadership, who you've now turned into coaches, and they've got to be part of the mix, and you've got non-exec directors and other stakeholders, and your chairman who's part of them. How do you manage all of that? And is that where your time is spent, and letting the staff do the rest? Is that?
Yes, I mean that you kind of hit it on the nail, which is stakeholder management, managing the expectations of diverse stakeholders. Is
sometimes conflicting.
Very often conflicting is one of the most important things that we have to do, and that I have to do as a CEO. And yes, very often around the non-executive board, we have discussions about how do we cope with all those conflicting changes. So, an obvious example I'll give you is the fact that we want to develop new homes, as we mentioned earlier, in order to meet increasing housing needs. But at the same time, we want to decarbonise our homes. Now, remember, in this country, we have some of the least energy efficient homes compared to other countries in Europe, and we have some of the oldest housing stock compared to others in Europe. And social housing stock is no exception to that, although our energy performance certificates are generally higher than it is in the private rented sector. Nevertheless, two-thirds of all of our homes are at an EPC level C and above, which is basically a level which is considered to be a reasonable energy efficiency to address the cost of living crisis that resulted from the high fuel costs and so on. So we've been investing a lot to make sure the other third of our homes are brought up to a higher level, and that costs money. I'll give you an example. Our stock investment budget, capital budget, has gone up to 24 million for the next financial year. 3 years ago, it was around 9 million. So it's been a phenomenal increase. Now, there are trade-offs. There are opportunity costs, because the more we invest in existing homes to make sure they're fit for purpose, they're of a very high standard, that they've got, they reduce the likelihood of damp and mold and other issues. The more we invest in the safety of our homes and the quality of our homes, the less we are able to invest in new homes. So the option of saying we do one and not the other is not an option. As you say, we've got stakeholders who want to ensure that we achieve both. So really, this is about a balance, and the best way to overcome that is to actually have a really open and transparent discussions with all of our stakeholders, so that they understand the business model, and we do this with the lenders all the time. So they understand our business model, and they understand the choices that we have to make They understand our vision and our mission and our long-term strategy. And actually, a long-term strategy, when we look to develop that, involves their considerations anyway. So we're not kind of acting like an island. No organisation is an island. We've got to see ourselves as part of that wider system. So we're constantly having dialogue with our stakeholders. We get them involved in the development of our business plan. And we actually, I see it as an important part of my role and the board's role to be accountable to all those stakeholders.
Just a quick one before we move on to stakeholders. This must be a difficult one. So your tenants owe you money. Private landlord kicks them out. That must be a difficult conversation because of the conflicting you've got. Got to make the money, so you've got to be strict. But there may be circumstances from a societal perspective. How do you reconcile that? And what do you tell your debt chasers? Is that easy or
Well, it's not easy, and I suppose one of the distinctions between affordable housing providers and private landlords is that private landlords wouldn't necessarily think twice about, making sure that if they don't get the money, they take the ultimate action, which is to evict people. We don't do that lightly at all. In fact, out of, over 20,000 tenancies last year, the number of people we would have ended their tenancy is in single figures. And the reason, and actually many of them were not about rent arrears, about other issues. If you're causing nuisance in your neighbourhood, then really it's not fair on the rest of the neighbourhood for us not to take any action with that. But the other thing we do is we invest a lot of time and effort and resources in doing preventative work. So we have a Money Matters team that last year raised £2.4 million on behalf of residents. So by virtue of their intervention, working with residents, they help those residents to raise benefits, which they wouldn't have perhaps otherwise been able to do. And there's no better way than that to enable them to pay their rent, than to work with them to say, okay, well, this is your situation. We have people who are benefit experts, provide debt advice, and when they can't, they signpost them into other organisations who can do that.
Now, when you think of a housing association, particularly as we've just spoken, you think of a solid building, you think of doors, windows, bathrooms, you think of client base, pays, whatever the money's due. Then you hear at the recent, I don't know, people may be listening and watching this months later, but you hear the problem with productivity. You hear that the government, that's the Tory government at the moment, at this time of talks about the use of IT and tech to improve productivity. The example cited was the Passport Office and how quick and how well they've managed to move using tech and increasing productivity. They want to do the same with the NHS. Are there opportunities then in housing, which is seen as a really staid, non-moving, I don't want to say lack of innovation, but is there scope for innovation to bring that, bring it into the new century? Does that make sense? Is there scope? Can we do something with housing?
I think we as businesses should always look at innovative ways of doing things, and actually we're constantly looking at our processes to look at how technology can be used to automate certain things. So I'll give you an example. At the moment we have a KPI dashboard on asset compliance issues that's entirely more or less automated. Many, many years ago it would have required quite a few people to dig out information from different sources, from different systems, some of them spreadsheets, some of them mainframe systems, to put all of that together into a dashboard. Now that's largely automated. So that's an example of the sort of things we're constantly looking at, particularly when it comes to consumers who require services from us to see if there's any likelihood of them going on the website, reporting issues, and being able to track progress on their repairs order, for instance. That's something we're looking at. So I suppose there's always scope for greater, efficiency in the way we manage processes. I mean, it's never going to be the panacea, of course, and ultimately, you use the example of local authorities who are being pushed to do that, but they're starved of resources. That's, of course they need to look at productivity improvements, but ultimately, since 2010, when the austerity began in terms of cutbacks in public services, local authorities have been the recipients of some of the biggest cutbacks. And in a sense, there are consequences for those actions, and we're now beginning to see some of those.
Now, just before we conclude, a bit about you, because I'm intrigued as someone who's been a top leader for now 20 odd years. You've seen change, you've seen technology, you've seen different administrations, politically speaking. What motivates you is the first goal. What's kept you going 20 years? Because this is a strange animal. This is not private sector, this is not public sector, it's a bit of both. You have the constraints, the financial constraints of the private sector in terms of finance. You've got a due responsibility in terms of keeping your clients happy with great regulation. You've got the government. So it's a very... So what gets you up in the morning? That's a difficult job with all these stakeholders. What motivates you then? Because most leaders, there's something that motivates them to get up every morning.
Yes, that's a really good question. Well, I'm not a glutton for punishment, that's for sure. I really, really feel privileged to do what I do. I really enjoy my job. No, there are tough times. There are good times and not so good times. But actually, to me, when you see the end product of what our people do, which is make a difference to people's lives, by virtue of some of the interventions of our colleagues within EMH, we have people with learning difficulties who are better able to cope with their lives. We have somebody who was homeless, who's now got a home, a roof under his or her, over his or her head. And, we employ some great people and we build their talent. All of those things, building people's talent, providing services that make a real difference to society. And actually, one of the most rewarding part of what I do is working with other agencies in an area to contribute to the place-shaping agenda. Yeah. So, when we build a home, that's one aspect of it. But building a home is just the start of the process. Is when you let a home to somebody, that's only the start of the process. They're part of a community, they're part of a neighbourhood. And actually, we engage in neighbourhood management as much as we do in tenancy, contractual management. Again, a private landlord would only do the latter.
That's right.
We look at the whole thing. For instance, when there's crime and disorder issues, there's no way we can resolve that ourselves. We do it by working in partnership with the police and social services and probation and other departments, and working with the communities themselves. So place shaping is an important part of what we do. But actually, all of those things motivate me. But actually, I would say, working with some great colleagues, and we put a lot of focus on EDI, and to me, psychological safety is very important. So that everybody should be able to bring entirely themselves to work. Whatever your characteristics are. And one of the things that we put a lot of focus on is, if there's anything where there is zero tolerance, it's about people who make, either homophobic comments or comments against anyone with the protected characteristics. That's not acceptable. It's not in keeping with our values, and it doesn't contribute to psychological safety. So I think the ability to make people psychologically safe at work means you're going to get a lot more out of them. They're going to be motivated, and I'll be motivated because of that.
So we talked earlier about succession planning. And succession planning comes from just employing the next level of people. but actually looking for the next leaders to take forward this organisation. What do you look for? What can you spot? What do you see in a person that says to you, that is a leader that I want to employ? So this could be in interviews or succession planning. And if somebody said to you, who could replace you, what kind of traits would you be looking for to replace you, but also traits you're looking for to encourage the next generation up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, in terms of who replaces me is a matter for the board.
Yep.
But I do know, and what the board will be looking for, is the right combination of somebody with the right values, the ability to be motivated by making a difference to the communities who we work with, but also to have the right commercial acumen to be able to put those two together. And actually, going back to the kind of people we would recruit, I think that kind of sums it up. You start with the right attitudes, the right approach, the right values. And actually, technical knowledge can be learnt.
Yeah.
But values are more embedded. Yes, of course, you can change them. You can acquire new ones, get rid of bad ones. But on the whole, they're more part of your DNA. So really, you look at somebody with the right values and attitude, the ability to serve our customers, provide the best possible services, to manage their team and lead them effectively and manage the talent. Get those values and then make sure they've got a commercial acumen, because if you put those two together, we can be an extremely powerful business.
This is definitely my final question. So, you spent most of your time in, I like the way you used it, place-making activity. So what would you say, why should a young person enter the housing sector? Why would somebody look to enter the housing sector as a career? Because you've done it and you've made a success of it, but I bet when you were 20 you never thought, oh, am I wrong? Perhaps you always thought you were a housing person, no?
No, I didn't. I mean, the way I got into the housing sectors, when I left university in the early 80s, I knew that I did a degree in economics, but I knew that I wanted to do something that made a difference.
Okay.
So I did some odd jobs and working in the tax office and so on. And I thought I wanted to be a kind of social worker or something like that. But I saw this job at a local authority working on the front line with homeless people and people in housing need. And I thought, well, that kind of fits into what would motivate me. So I joined the local authority. And actually, that's over 35 years ago. And it's the best move I made. Because to me, and this answers your question directly, why should people join the housing sector? Because here you get some great careers. Every housing association has people on the front line dealing with customers. They have backroom people dealing with finance, IT, HR, treasury management. You name it, we've got a whole range of occupations within, maintenance surveyors and so on. As well as development project managers and so on. So we have a whole range of careers within housing associations. As well as that, you're doing a job that makes a real difference.
Yeah, making
so not only are you able to meet your career aspirations and get paid well, but you do something that has a tangible benefit for the communities and the areas where you work. I would say there's no better motivation than that to join a housing association.
That brings to the end of a fantastic podcast. But let me just pick on some of the major points you've done. You've talked about the importance of culture, values. You've talked about the importance when you recruit of training people and onboarding them. I love the coaching idea, by the way. I think I've not heard that before. Where you actually bring someone in and say, you're going to be a leader, but actually you're going to coach. You talked about for a business to scale properly and to have quality assurance in place, and so that people know all these bits, the importance of systems and processes. We talked about incremental versus transformation. You know, when do you decide which strategy to go for? And you talked about transformation normally includes tech and digital and staff. But you said it was more likely to occur when the external environment, which is interesting, was changing rapidly. Because you said an organisation needs to always remember that it's fit for purpose. Remove the blame culture and have an enabling culture, was what you said. And make sure you're testing that your staff have the same value as when they joined, and to make sure there's no divergence between what they're expecting and what the organisation is doing. We talked about managing a plethora of stakeholders and how for, I think, today's modern leader that becomes now more and more important. So probably communication skills and the ability to talk to people from different backgrounds. We've talked about productivity and carbon and bringing IT in place. I think your organisation is different, and you've had, as a leader, have to look at your customers different. It's not just pure monetary, but all the extra responsibilities in how they fit in society. You know, you even give them advice on preventative, money matters. We talked about what makes a good leader, and I think you reminded again, you know, values comes first, attitude comes. And of course, you know, you've got the banks to please, you've got money to raise in order to invest in all these products. So a level of commercial acumen is very important. I think this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. It's been a wide-ranging conversation, but thank you for all you do for the Housing Association. And I think, please, certainly at Nachural, when we gave you the award for contribution to the region. And I think actually, we're a bit unfair, it wasn't just to the region, actually it was to the sector and the place-making agenda. So thank you very much, Chan. Thank you for taking that time. And by the way, your hospitality was fantastic as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ninder. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And your summing up was absolutely amazing. We should be swapping places. But thank you. It was a pleasure to...
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.